Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning to our colleagues and friends joining us from the States. My name is Zsuzsanna Vég, and I'm a program officer at the German Marshall Fund of the United States based in our Berlin office. I would like to very warmly welcome you to today's discussion under the title Democracy Under Pressure, How Illiberal Politics Reshape Europe. Today's conversation takes place in the framework of the AUTHLIB project. AUTHLIB stands for Neo-Authoritarianisms in Europe and the Liberal Democratic Response, and is funded by the European Union and UK Research and Innovation, and is led by the Central European University. The topic of today's discussion and our overall AUTHLIB project is the attempt to understand the variety of challenges that liberal democracy faces today in Europe, and particularly what a rising illiberal challenge really means for democratic polities, societies in the European Union and around the world. As we all know, democracy is a political system that is complex, complicated, and in its manifestations as such is undoubtedly diverse around the world and even in Europe. Its preservation, therefore, also requires constant tending to by all those actors that are participating in it, let them be filling various functions, citizens, scholars, politicians, or activists. So as scholars, we are also trying to contribute to that process here and look closely at this illiberal challenge that seems to be on the rise around Europe. To help us gain a more thorough understanding of what this challenge is, why it is gaining ground, and what it can realistically achieve, we have today with us three excellent scholars from Europe and the United States joining us, whom I would now like to very briefly just introduce to you. We have with us Petra Gasti, who is an associate professor of democratic theory at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Charles University in Prague. Petra is one of the principal investigators of our AUTHLIB project. Welcome, and thank you for joining us, Petra. From AUTHLIB's leading institution in Central European University, we have with us Bálint Mikola, who is a postdoctoral research fellow at the CEU Democracy Institute based in Budapest. Welcome, Bálint, and thank you. And last but definitely not least, we have with us Marlène Laruelle, who is a professor at the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and she's also the director of the university's Illiberalism Studies program. Thank you, Marlène, for being with us today. Thank you for joining. I also have to add that today's conversation is also building on a journal special issue that AUTHLIB has put out just recently. And all our speakers are actually also authors of this special issue. This volume was published in the Politics and Governance Journal and addresses a variety of themes under the overarching umbrella of illiberal politics in Europe. I will put the link to the issue to the chat for you. It's open access, so it's freely available, and I very strongly encourage you to take a look at it because the contributions are really wide-ranging and add a lot to what we already know about illiberalism, both from a scholarly but also an analytical policy stance. So after a short introduction, I would just add a couple housekeeping remarks. Please, if you have questions, comments, do make use of the Q&A function. We would definitely like to hear your perspective, and I will do my best to pick up as many questions from you as I can. We will have first a short conversation with our three panelists, but then I will turn to your questions as well. Other than that, I think without any further ado, I would just dive into our conversation and pose my first very easy question to Petra. I've been using this term illiberalism, and I think we hear it more and more. By now, probably it rivals the term populism. What is it? What is the essence of illiberalism? And when we are talking about the illiberal challenge to liberal democracy, what does it really constitute?
Okay, so first, thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity. I will try to, I mean, what I want to say, and this is all easy questions turn out to be the most difficult, the most difficult one. So I will try to make this justice, and I want to say that we are building here on a lot of scholarship, not even beyond the journal. I think two principal scholars, our viewers, if they're interested in this, should definitely follow their work, is Marlene, who is here, and our own Zsolt Enyedi, who has contributed really very much to constituting this field. So what I will try to say is that when we speak about illiberalism, we are not describing rejection of democracy, but rather a redefinition of democracy. So illiberalism preserves elections and popular sovereignty, but strips democracy of its liberal core: the rule of law, checks and balances, pluralism, minority rights. It claims to speak for the people while constraining institutions that protect people from the majority. So it kind of cherry picks from the core of liberal democracy, which is majority rule and minority protection, gets rid of the minority protection. We are not speaking of ethnic, religious minorities. We are speaking of political minorities. So illiberalism rests on three, let's say, basic interconnected ideas: the unrestrained popular sovereignty, the belief that the majority will should not be limited in any way; ethno-nationalist or anti-pluralist, anti-individualism, so the subordination of diversity to homogeneity, hierarchy, and moral order. I think this is very important. The moral aspect of illiberalism, I think, is really, really important. So it brings back these ideas of good and evil. And the third is anti-liberal, anti-globalism, so rejection of supranational authority, of cosmopolitanism, of universal rights in the name of homogeneity of the nation. So this does not necessarily appear as a one coherent ideology. So there are many flavors. It's like many flavors of ice cream, but most ice creams are going to have a core. There will be some cream in the ice cream. So this is very often going to be there. There can be also sprinkled some other elements of nationalism, populism, authoritarianism. But I think that this is if you ask for the essence, this is in the essence. It's the rejection of modernity. It's a return to a more simple, non-individualistic society. It's the promise of that, and also more presenting this idea as a morally superior to the contemporary complex, cosmopolitan, diverse world.
Thank you very much, Petra. And of course, when I said it's an easy question, I was joking. We, in the project itself, have spent months on trying to arrive to something that we all agree on, what illiberalism is, and I think we semi-succeeded. If you allow me just a brief follow-up question. So you said that illiberalism does not seek to completely do away with democracy, but wants to redefine it. And of course, looking at various challenges of democracy is also in itself nothing new. We have been previously, and you mentioned it also in the introduction of the journal Special Issue, we have faced a variety of challenges to democracy. In the 20th century, we were often talking about the hollowing out of parties, erosion of ideological competition, as you list, declining of citizen engagement. Illiberalism as such sounds also qualitatively new, but does it follow from these previous pre-existing challenges? Was it there already before? It just gained ground since then? How would you place it in this context?
I think sure there are like elements that are woven into. I think it very much depends on the salience and on how these elements are woven. So that will also explain the variation across countries, because, for example, there are countries where the issue of salience is very important, or it can be the moral element can also overlap with the idea of redefining the relationship between church and state. So bringing much more church into politics. But that, if I take that as an example, that would not resonate so well in France. I mean, yes on the fringes, but predominantly not. But the resonance of bringing church more closer to politics openly resonates much better in Poland, where the role of church, while not so much as before, it's still quite there. I think that what's important is to say that illiberalism is democratic in procedure, but anti-liberal in its substance, and that the novelty, what's new, is not the forms, or, as I said, flavors, the types, the variation, but the novelty for me, and what we found in this special issue or confirmed, the novelty lies in normalization within the European Union. It is here to stay. It's nothing new. It's not a passing phase. It's not coming from outside. It's inside of the house. The phone is ringing there. Illiberalism no longer signals the periphery, but mainstream alternative model to liberal democracy in Europe.
Thank you very much, Petra, for that. And I would then just pick up the ball that you threw up and pass it on to Marlene, because you say that what we see is a normalization, that it's not just a passing phase. What led to this? Petra also mentioned that there is a variety of illiberal flavors, if you will, but it seems that it is on the rise across Europe. So what is it that resonates across the Union or across the continent even, and I would go as far as across the Atlantic? What are the cross-cutting political, socioeconomic factors that you would highlight leading to the current situation and fueling the rise of illiberalism?
Well, I think you have you have really kind of systemic structural transformation of what was the post-Second World War social order, in which some form of liberalism were in a cultural hegemony. And what we are seeing is the end of that cultural hegemony. And that suddenly you have indeed alternative ideological or social construction that are getting legitimized. And I see at least four kind of systemic transformation. One is the classic social economic one, right? That a feeling, and we can discuss how much is, reality, how much is feeling or interpretation. But the idea of a lack of prosperity, first for blue collar, then for kind of white collar middle classes, and the idea of, permanent progress on which the Western world was built for very long, this idea that the next generation will live worse than the previous one. So the idea that democracy is not going anymore with prosperity and that we have reached the maximum of what our economic model could bring. So this really deep feeling of déclassement of the population that have, and that you have a rise of inequality where the existing liberalism cannot find any solution and doesn't seem to have any way of kind of solving the inequality. And you can, if you look at the current number, you never had such a high kind of disparity in living standard between big metropolitan area and rural region, both in Europe and in the US, right? So I think that is really one of the big kind of sociological background that explain the very deep kind of demographic reason for the rise of and social economic reason for the rise of illiberalism. The second one that in a sense Petra partly mentioned is that for decades liberalism in power got associated with technocracy, expertise governance, and gradually became a language of depolitization, of a no choice, like we are the best, we are telling you that there is no other choice than going in that direction. And for me, it's really important to read illiberalism as the coming back of ideology and choice, of people saying, no, there is another way of doing things, of thinking about public policies, of reimagining democracy. And so it's kind of bringing back diversity and conflict into the political discussion. So I think that's the second point. Then, of course, change in the media ecosystem. And we had a lot of course, discussion on social media and the role they play. But I think it's much more than the social media, right? It's the whole ecosystem of, news channel that can run 24/7, the whole newspaper transformation also. I think media has really become the driving force behind social fragmentation. They are the one participating in polarization. And so what was making us living together has been also largely destroyed by the media ecosystem that is now really kind of devising, a tool for devising and no more for unifying. And then globally, I think we have been moving towards societies where citizens feel atomized, right? They are centered around consumption, ultra-individualism. And at the same time, people need and feel and ask for, belonging, meaning, community. So you have this kind of tension that you see in the surveys that people ask for, feel uncomfortable with both being individual consumer, and at the same time wanting some more than that, some meaning and community. And so I think one of the questions is that why is the right-wing answer to this anxiety seems to be more relevant than the left-wing answer, because you could say the left-wing was also bringing answers to some of these questions, but doesn't seem to work, right? So I think it's all these elements that are just telling us that it's the end of the cultural hegemony of post-World War liberalism that we see now. And as Petra was saying, illiberalism is here to stay because it's coming with an alternative to what we have been seeing as in practice liberalism, that is here to stay and coming with answer to all, at least, I'm not saying the answer are working, I say it's coming with at least in a narrative answer to several of these elements about how do we rethink democracy and how do we rethink the community and how do we try to reinvent living together with this kind of illiberal kind of software.
Thank you very much, Marlon. And 2 points here. You mentioned that there is a sense of disappearance of permanent progress and the right coming forward with answers, seemingly attractive answers to voters. So if in our audience there are people who are interested more in this, I would like to draw your attention again to our special issue, which does treat this subject on multiple accounts. We have a really fascinating paper about illiberal social policy in Europe, about the welfare state ideas of the right, by Dorottya Sikra and Laurica Autisha. And also there's a really interesting paper on what illiberal actors actually implement from such promises once they enter power. This is written by Franziska Wagner, Dean Schaefer, and Mehmet Yavuz, titled Opposition to Government and Back. I will also put these directly into the chat. So as you see, we are wide-ranging, and I very much encourage you to take a closer look. But the second point I wanted to follow up on, Marlene, you mentioned that social media, the changing news cycle, and the transformation of the entire media ecosystem is facilitating the rise of illiberalism. And you yourself look quite a bit at discourses. And I wanted to ask you about maybe it actually links to your final point. Why is the mainstreaming of such narratives, the liberals' narratives, seem to be more successful today? Because it's not only that there is an alternative, but we very often see that the mainstream picks it up, and the narratives, the alternatives, enter mainstream politics. So why do you think this happens, and what really is the source of success here?
Yeah, it's a really complicated question, and I think there are several types of answer. One is that illiberal leaders have been able to partner or reinvent some form of access to youth culture, to social media. They have been able, and that's, for example, very visible in the US, of course, around Trump first election and then second re-election, of kind of capturing, you know, the podcaster, for example, culture, which really play a role in kind of talking to young people, being able to capture pop culture and transforming pop culture as a tool to introduce politics to younger generation, which is something that I think both from the mainstream liberal and the leftist culture, this kind of shift hasn't been done or didn't work well. So you have really a kind of illiberal avant-garde that has been thought in kind of trying to invent cultural product to speak politics to young people. That has been working. Then you have, of course, the kind of the capture of algorithms, and then the role of the big tech companies in kind of also shifting rights and therefore contributing by the algorithms at promoting more right-wing narrative than left-wing ones. And then you have indeed a porosity between, and that's very visible in Europe, between right, or let's say far right, what we usually classify as far right narrative and classic right narrative, and a mainstreamization of language around immigration, security, national identity, also because it's reflecting in the population. Right? So if you are a classic right politicians and you have 80% of your population or 70% of your population that in surveys say, oh, they care about, you know, immigration, or they think there are too many illegal migrants, you almost automatically will tend to follow surveys and shift your language towards something that will look more far right? So you have a lot of elements that have to be taken into consideration that are both the kind of, opportunistic adjustment of politicians to what they think the population think. You have the way the media communities and their corporate leader and owner have been developing their own strategy, and then you have the kind of the cultural transformation that the liberal field has been able to do in really kind of leading and reinventing what it means to do politics and how you speak politics in a very kind of Gramscian way, in using culture as a way to speak about society and societal issues to young generation in particular.
Thank you very much, Marlon. And this is a good segue for us to move on also to Balint, who is looking particularly at the cultural and educational policies of illiberal actors. Petra before mentioned that the moral aspect of illiberalism is very important. Marlon also touched on the various shifts in both the narratives and the cultural landscape. So Balint, my question to you would be, to what extent do these cultural policies of illiberal actors are a matter of conviction? So the classic question, do they really mean it? And to what extent it is it a strategic product, part of strategic statecraft? You have been looking at in our special issue, particularly on the Hungarian and the Polish case, and I will also share that in a moment. So maybe if you also want to touch a little bit on those particular case studies, that would be really fascinating.
Okay, thank you very much for this intriguing question. So in fact, I think what is puzzling to many observers of illiberalism is why is there a disconnection between the scholarly use of this label and between its actual use by politicians? And that's something that has intrigued me as well. That as you may remember, Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orbán, used illiberalism in one of his famous speeches in 2014, which was a declaration of his intent to transform Hungary into an illiberal state. But then he hasn't really followed up on this idea or elaborated it too much, and therefore the job of interpretation was left for scholars. And then I think what is a real test of like whether he and similar actors meant it is whether this illiberal conviction is manifested in how they treat those spheres that are closely related to knowledge production, and in that sense, I think culture and education are key to understanding their motives. And here I would turn again to a quote from Prime Minister Orbán, who in 2018, in the same speech that he makes every year at the summer university, he said that now was the time that we must embed the political system in a cultural era, which signified that yes, he kind of meant that culture and winning the ideological war on the cultural front was a priority to them. And then what we did in the paper you mentioned, which compares Hungary and Poland, and another paper that I have co-authored with several other contributors from the AUTHLIB project, including from Petra's team, as well as Polish and Slovak colleagues. We looked at patterns across the Visegrad 4 region, which is Hungary, Poland, Czechia, and Slovakia. And what we found, okay, so the general result is perhaps not very surprising that we find mixed patterns. So if you look at Hungary, since Fidesz has been in power since 2010, and Poland under the Law and Justice government, it is quite clear that these two governments had genuine ideological motives to transform culture and to instill certain content in educational curricula, to transform cultural institutions in not only in terms of institutional reshuffling, but also in terms of the values that they represent. So put much higher emphasis on national history, history that is all in many cases revisionist version of history, Christian values in particular, and conservative moral values. Whereas at the same time in Czechia under Mr. Babis's previous government, and for a long time also Slovakia under Robert Fico, were much more pragmatic. We in this article we called them technocratic populists, but the main point is that even though they did engage in the creation of new cultural institutions and they significantly altered the distribution of resources, this was cast in a managerial language. They talked about efficiency. They talked about how these institutions should cater more to the market needs. So it wasn't so much about the values that they should represent. This was very clear from, so you could ask, okay, how do we know that? Are we trying to read the motives of politicians, and is this not purely speculative? So we looked at the content of their speeches using quantitative text analytical methods, and these distinctions are based on the vocabulary that they are using. So how much they talk about nation, religion, Christian values, and how much they talk about things like the market, management, efficiency, and so on. And there is such a division, even though one needs to note that since Robert Fico has been back in power in Slovakia, he has taken a quite significant turn, and it seems like that cultural policy in Slovakia is also more driven by illiberal ideology now than it was during his previous terms. So that would be my first take, but I'm glad to answer follow-ups.
And of those, I have many. But the first one would be, what would be your takeaway looking at all these cases? And you mentioned just the shift of Robert Fico as well, that cultural policy became more important than it was for him before. So why do we observe such shifts, and under what conditions actually illiberals succeed to implement their program? I think it's fairly clear-cut. In Hungary, there are no constraints. Fidesz can do whatever it wants. Constitutional majority is there. But in other cases, when maybe there are coalition governments or other forms of constraints, we see more or less implementation of the illiberal agenda. What stands out for you in your research?
Okay, so two of the factors that we identified that make a difference in how such agendas are implemented are, as you mentioned, the extent to which these parties hold legislative majority. That's very important, and that's a distinguishing mark of the Fidesz government, and to a lesser extent the PiS government between 2015 and 2023. And the other factor is to what extent these institutions are centralized. So if you look at attempts for the takeover of cultural institutions, it seems like centralized institutions are a much easier prey. So for instance, public media, that's usually among the first targets. and it's very easy to replace those in charge. It's entirely funded by the state, so that's an obvious choice for waging these cultural transformations. Again, similar examples are, for example, film funding by the state. That's usually a centralized bureaucracy, which can be replaced and directed towards ideological goals. I think it's much more difficult to change decentralized structures, and this is one of the findings that also stands out from our comparison between Hungarian and Polish education systems, that even though there were similar attempts of introducing national curricula with ideological content, since the Polish education system was much more decentralized to start with, it was also more resistant, and the local education authorities kept some of their independence. And one area where I would like to reflect on what Marlene said earlier, which I think is interesting and a contested area, is that of popular culture, because as you mentioned, there are areas where illiberal actors can easily become dominant through basically championing technological change. So creating more podcasts than their opponents do, spending more money on social media, creating TikTok channels earlier than political opponents do. So there is that, but then I think it is complemented by spontaneous and somewhat uncontrollable movements in like genuinely independent, we may also call it underground culture, but it's not necessarily underground. So again, I would abuse my country expertise a bit and talk about Hungary in this respect. But if you look at popular music culture in Hungary, during the past at least 5 years, the most popular actors have been like very vocally anti-government, and some of it is entirely spontaneous, but some of it is also fueled by the market. And I think the positive message here is that there is an independent cultural market that cannot be completely overtaken. And I think that refers to more of artistic production than just music. So as a bottom line, I think the big centralized publicly funded bureaucracies are very easy to take over, but spontaneous artistic expression is a tougher nut to crack.
Thank you very much, Bernd. We covered quite some ground already. So I would just, before moving on with further questions addressed to all of you, I would again like to encourage our audience to share their reflections and their questions in the Q&A box that is under us on the screen. And I will be picking up those questions as well. In fact, maybe before going on, I will do just that, because we do already have a question that directly connects to what Bernd was discussing. And the question goes, one of the most frequently made accusations against liberal democracy among illiberals is that this liberal democracy itself has turned illiberal, with PC cancel culture, limitations on free speech, and so on and so forth. It directly links to the question of the so-called culture war, if you will. What is your take on this accusation, Bernd, or whoever else would like to jump in on this? Petra, please.
I'm happy to, and Bernd can, of course, correct me. So I think this is a really important question because it exposes the core rhetorical inversion of the illiberal discourse. So illiberal actors routinely claim that liberal democracy itself has become illiberal through either cancel culture or PC tyranny and so on. And what many of the contribution in the special issue shows that this is a discursive weapon, not an analytical truth. It reframes liberal democracy's self-correction as repression. I would like to make just very briefly 3 points as examples. Liberal limits protecting freedom. Constitutional constraints on hate speech or abuse of power are not censorship, but safeguards ensuring equal participation and dignity. Illiberals conflate accountability with oppression. So accountability for hate speech is not oppression. It's a constitutional framework. Disagreement isn't repression. What is usually called cancel culture is a societal contestation. It's again accountability, but it's not a state coercion. So freedom of speech is freedom from state intervention into speech. So just that people disagree with you or don't give you enough likes doesn't mean that this is repression. So true illiberalism becomes when the state silences dissent through captured media or courts. And finally, the ideological inversion. Illiberals turn the liberal tolerance into a moral weakness and rights protection into elite control. So this is weaponization of openness to argue for closure. So I think, in short, illiberals exploit liberal democracy's openness to delegitimize it, and the fact that we argue about the limits of freedom is what keeps us free. Illiberal regimes end the argument. So that's where I would be there.
To add to that and bring some nuances or differences with what Petra said. So first, for example, for the US case, I would be much more nuanced. I think the polarization of the US society, and that may be different from Europe, invite you to look that polarization means you're polarized on both sides, meaning you also polarize on the left. And you have been cases where in some very specific context, and I wouldn't kind of generalize, right? You also have a refusal in some context dominated by some leftist group of accepting to listen to different voices. So I think in some academic context, you had the cancel culture was a reality of refusing to listen to voices that wouldn't fit what was considered their own perception. So I would be much more nuanced about your own assessment. I think there was voices on the left in the US asking to cancel right-wing voices and having themselves difficulties accepting to recognize the plurality of perception of the world. I think that was something that was very visible among some young, subculture in the US. I don't think it was the majority, and I agree that illiberals made them a big stuff while it was not a dominant thing, but it was there. Then I would be also much more nuanced on what has been happening in Europe in terms of freedom of speech since October 7. I think the way a lot of European countries have been treating debates on pro-Palestinian speeches, I think it's, for me, very problematic. I think there have been violation of freedom of speech in the name. I mean, all the debates around defense of Israel, discussion on what is pro-Palestinian, what is anti-Semitism has been a very blurry discussion, and I would be much more nuanced on the way European countries have been really defending freedom of speech on a very clear way. I think it's much more complicated and blurry, and I think you even had Germany had really ambiguous discussion. I found there have been, so I think it's not so clearly black and white. And I think I agree that illiberals are weaponizing the debates of freedom of speech, of course. But I think the debate is not clear on the liberal side. And then I think there is another feature happening, which is and it's not the illiberal liberalism, but it's the authoritarian liberalism growing. That is that liberal government in power sometimes need to become more and more authoritarian on the way they have to deal with the grassroots democratic protest arriving from their own society, when their own society are asking for much more direct democracy. I'm thinking on the way, the case of France, the way the Macron government dealt with Yellow Vest, dealt with, a lot of environmental protest. I mean, the use of police violence has been really problematic for a government claiming is a liberal one. So I think you have much more ambiguity on those who said they are representing classic liberalism, on the way they have been dealing with freedom of speech and with some form of kind of, legitimate use of violence. So just to say that I totally agree, liberal weaponize all these debates, but there are also complexity. I think it's more and more difficult for liberals themselves to navigate this water. And I agree, it's part of the so-called self-correction of liberalism. But I think, especially on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think liberalism has largely failed at dealing with its own contradiction. And if you look at what liberalism should be seen from the global south, we failed. We, the West, we, Europe, we failed at our own principles. So I think the debate is much more complex than that. So just to kind of put some kind of debates internally to us at the round table.
Absolutely, that's very welcome, Marlene, and also thank you to both Petra and you. Balint, would you like to still chime in on this?
Just very shortly. So I think one of the points that hasn't been mentioned or is only indirectly included in the question that so there's a lot of emphasis in these debates on cancel culture and disinviting speakers who are deemed politically problematic, and probably you are right that both sides are culpable in this respect. But here I would like to highlight one of the terms that Joad Enidi has used to describe illiberalism, which is this component of closed society, which is basically anti-universalism combined with irrationality and incivility. And the reason I think it's important is that because these political actors and regimes in which they govern, they often undermine public faith in the rational discussions, and it's very often not the case that speakers are cancelled or disinvited, but that they are either prohibited to attend events or they just simply always decline, and there's basically no dialogue between the sides. And I think this makes these mutual accusations much easier on both sides, that if there's no actual discussion going on between liberals and illiberals, it's much easier to put the blame on each other and say that the other side is prohibiting or limiting free speech. So here I would like to make I don't know, to advocate for the revitalization of meaningful and rational public debates across the ideological spectrum, because as someone who not only studies but lives in a regime that has experienced this kind of ideological turn since 15 years, I would say that the change in the quality of public debates is quite dramatic. So I think this should somehow be reversed.
Thank you, Balint. And this already shows or brings up some examples of what is really at stake with the rise of illiberalism, liberalism failures to live up to its own standards are also obviously contributing to this. But we do definitely see rising polarization as a result. If we look at Europe, what do you really think is at at stake for the democracies of Europe? How do you see the potential of this growing and strengthening illiberal movement to reshape the politics, the political landscape? Petra already mentioned that through the normalization, illiberalism is here to stay. We have talked about the degradation of public discourse just now. How will the political landscape of Europe look like in 5-10 years if the current trends continue?
You begin?
Please go ahead, Marlon.
Okay. Well, I think we will find ourselves in a situation, as I was saying, where it's the end of the cultural hegemony of liberalism. Doesn't mean it's the end of liberalism per se. It's just the end of its domination. So we will be in a kind of system of plurality where we will have liberalism and illiberalism coexisting politically, with some governments being led by illiberal coalition, sometimes losing election, so-called liberals coming back in power, sometimes the liberal coalition stay in power and then become an illiberal regime in the sense that they are staying in power and being able to transform the institution for longer. So I think the whole of Europe will be like that. Some country will be shifting back and forth. Some country will be stabilizing on the liberal side. Some country will be resisting on the liberal side. And then the European institution will be in a much kind of mixed situation. And that will be the new reality of Europe, which will be a big transformation for, I think, the European political project, because so far, for very long, that was the idea that, oh, it's just Hungary, you know, and then, okay, maybe Slovakia is sometimes problematic, or, okay, Meloni is a specific case because she's maybe illiberal on some aspect, but she's still playing the EU card. But I think globally, it will become much more complicated with each time different combination of, you can be illiberal but pro-EU, illiberal at home, anti-EU. So there will be a lot of different kind of flavor of the ice cream, as Petra was saying. But globally, it will transform the EU political project, and it will transform the domestic landscape. It will normalize illiberal projects, so they will just become part of the normal political landscape. And I think it will create the impression for the voter that, well, you can vote for a liberal party and it's not the end of the world, right? It's not so the kind of, you know, apocalyptical narrative from the liberal, like if you vote for them, it's the end, everything will collapse. Well, no, you know, people voted in Italy for Meloni and it's going largely okay. So that will participate to the normalization of the vote. But it also means that once they are in power, they will not be necessarily successful, or maybe even not successful at all, which will also at a certain point means, like, you know, what was making them interesting politically, while that they were never in power. So they were attractive because they were never tested in power. When they will be tested in government and not being successful, and maybe even fail, there will hopefully be a wave in the other direction, a new political offer. So I think we will just have a very polarized and pluralistic political offer, where liberal political party will have to rethink the way they offer liberalism, no more as the obvious normative system thing, like it's obviously us and the other are just crazy, dangerous, far-right people, and if you vote for them, it's like bringing Hitler in power. I mean, that narrative can only fail. You will have to reinvent liberalism in a pluralistic system to explain, yeah, my offer is really the best, and here are the arguments why it's the best, right? And that's, I think, will be the next step for liberal offers to kind of reinvent themselves and really compete on a pluralistic ideological market. And I think we are gradually moving toward that, but it's still not yet the case. And we are still having in a lot of countries the kind of old-fashioned narrative that doesn't work anymore. I think the kind of, be afraid of the Hitler arriving in power narrative doesn't work anymore. Citizens are not afraid of testing the far right or the liberal offer. So I think that's what will happen, and it will be just a new historical phase, and there will be countries kind of and citizens moving away, right? So we feel we are moving toward illiberalism, but some country will be testing it, and then they will move away from it also. So there will be a post-illiberalism moment also arriving. So I see it as a kind of, historic moment we have to go through where liberalism will have to reinvent itself. Hopefully it will work and they will find a way. But of course, the risk is that if you don't have the liberal offer able to compete, some government will become very entrenched. And once you are entrenched, you change the institution. And then, of course, exiting illiberalisms become very difficult. And that's all the question, at which moment you can still go back and at which moment you can, right? Like if Meloni is losing the next election in Italy, okay, she changed some institution, but she can still lose election and you can still have another coalition and it's still more or less Italy, right? Not deeply transformed. You look at the US, right? They are borderline because Trump is transforming much more. So if the Democrats are not back at the next election, then the US will take another direction that it will be very difficult to go back, right? It's a juncture that you won't go back easily. Hungary took another direction already a long time ago. Poland got the peace and then they were able to shift. So every country will have different trajectory depending on who is in the opposition to illiberalism.
Thank you, Marilyn. And I think it's all clear that the cultural hegemony of liberal democracy in Europe, at least, has ended. And but we also need to, I think, make or maybe amplify a qualitative change here. So we did have contestation of various ideas before the appearance and rise of illiberalism. It's not that within liberal democracy everybody agreed with everything. It's just, I think, what we are seeing now is that the contestation doesn't necessarily address policy directions or what and how should be prioritized while the political system and its institutional underpinnings are largely accepted. But what is also coming under contestation now is the very political system that we are functioning in. So we were mostly talking about the cultural aspects of illiberalism, but it also goes hand in hand, if given the opportunity, with a challenge to the institutions of democracy, not just the liberal values and principles, although maybe we could count their division of power, checks and balances, but with the contestation of the very institutions. And what we see now is that sort of challenge gaining ground. Liberal democracy is not the only game in town. There are new understandings of what may be democracy. And that's where we now also see that sort of competition. So I think it's important to underline here that it's not just yet another political cleavage that appears, but this is really affecting the fundamentals of the political system that we are operating in, the very rules of the game, and often also who is allowed to play it. So maybe that's just something that I would also like to just mention.
If I can just add very briefly, we were used to have that during the Cold War period with communism, which was a really alternative political system. It's just that we forgot that for 30 years, where for 30 years, indeed, all the alternatives were just mini nuanced inside the liberal democratic structure, but they were like details of adjustments. But liberalism did very well for decades when it was facing communism. We just kind of forgot the idea that it was not necessarily the hegemony for kind of so long. So we just have to relearn that.
Yeah, and here we very often actually see a contestant that masks itself as the very same system, maybe even the real understanding of the true understanding of the system. Petra, please.
Yeah, I thank you, and I just want to add perhaps two small points to what Marlene said and what you did, Zsuzsi. What the illiberal leaders do in power, and I want to reiterate what Balint said, it depends how much power, how big those majorities are. If those are constitutional majorities, it's a completely different thing. I also want to say that their institutional structures really matter, because if you have two chambers, so if you ask why law and justice in Poland never achieved what Viktor Orban did, it's because Viktor Orban has one chamber, single chamber. In Poland, you have two, and the majority in the Polish Senate of law and justice was always limited. What I want to say is that the institutions don't disappear. They are re-engineered rather than abolished. So courts, media, so they are there, but they are like emptied from within. And I think that this is really important to say that it's not going to disappear overnight. And the second point I wanted to make in reaction to Marlene, which I think is really important, is that what we need to understand that polarization works differently in multi-party systems. So the 95% of literature on polarization comes from two-party system in the United States. And what I wanted to give as an example from the recent 2025 Czech elections, that in multi-party system, if the liberals are basically, so yes, through polarization, you will have basically society polarized into two major pillars. You always, however, have the first-time voters or the non-voters that can enter, so they are not actually anywhere. And you have one, let's say, populist pillar. I don't want to call it illiberal. Populist pillar where some are more or less illiberal. And the mainstream pillar where actually also some may be, especially conservative parties have been, maybe I say flirting or curious, illiberal curious, bit curious about some aspect, especially you see confessional parties thinking that this return of religion is not at all bad because it's the good values and so on. So you have these two pillars, but there are differences within them, and there is a competition takes place both between and within. And what we have seen in Czech Republic is that basically exactly what Marlene was saying, the anti-populists were basically saying like this is the end of the world, like if they win, it's like out of NATO, out of European Union, and first train to Moscow. And I think that they have created a huge trap for themselves. It's a bad strategy in a multi-party system, because what Andrej Babiš, our future prime minister, did is he went to the public, and his final message was, of course, not out of the EU. It is that he stepped out and differentiated himself and put the extreme his extreme competitors to the extreme said, yes, they're trying to drag you there, but that's not me. It's always EU, it's always NATO, and you know I'm going to deliver to you. And he won a historic victory, the second biggest vote share in proportional system to get 35% of votes. It's a lot, but he was helped very, very much by the liberals throwing everybody thinking polarization works like in the US where you have just two choices.
Thank you very much, Petra. And I have put an article that relates directly to this from you and your PhD student, Alesh Mihal, into the chat. So it's a very interesting read. I encourage everybody to dive into that and also to send us your questions. The Q&A is still active and open, so please feel free to chime in there. Balint, would you like
Yes,
to add?
I just wanted to reiterate that I fully agree with what Marlene said earlier about that the liberal offer needs to be reformulated and needs to present itself as a credible challenger to liberal alternatives. And there I would also like to raise the question that what we are as political scientists and analysts of politics often discuss as a challenge to liberal democracy. I think we should test how much this proposition, how much this concern resonates with the public. So since much of the public discussion is not about different versions of democracy, but about who is a real democrat, and both liberals and illiberals position themselves as the best embodiments of true democracy. I think very few very educated citizens have these notions of we want to safeguard liberal democracy. So probably this has to be recast in a different, more approachable language, because many citizens do not really understand what is at stake or cannot relate to these discussions.
Thank you very much for that. And then, well, my follow-up question to all of you actually really just builds on this. We are saying, I think, in that there is agreement that the liberal offer is failing to maintain its attractiveness. There is another offer that is drawing more and more support. Polarization does not seem to be a winning strategy. Maybe reformulating the offer could be one, but how? Is there a silver bullet that would work everywhere? We just need to find it, because there seem to be some common factors for the illiberal offer that seems to resonate across the board. So should we just find something like that? Can we find something like that for the liberal offer? Maybe repackage, and it's going to get voters' attention again, or it's inevitably going to be a fragmented struggle case by case. Do you see positive examples or successful examples of liberals picking up the challenge and fighting back and actually succeeding? I think this is the question. Oh, Marlene, there you go. I was wondering whether this is the question. I have to pick one of you because
I think it's much more difficult when you are considered to be in power.
Yeah.
Right? By definition, it's easier not to be in power and to come up with the catchy, motto, traditional values, family, morality, whatever, than when you are in power. But if you look in societies where you have an authoritarian regime or something identified as illiberal and you are fighting against, you had very successful way of framing it. I mean, look at the, the Iranian protests, look at what has been happening in Ukraine. I mean, you have way of framing it. Look at the protests in Serbia. I mean, you have way of having a liberal offer that can be seen as attractive, right? I think in our societies, you could potentially have some type of mobilization. I mean, a few years ago, before COVID, there was an environmental protest. I wouldn't say it was necessarily liberal because it was probably more leftist than liberal, right? That was able to really mobilize the population around the idea, and in a sense, the kind of, the climate change action was probably one of the last universalistic narrative that we were sharing as citizen of the planet, one of these kind of last enlightenment universalistic ideas, and it was working pretty well, at least in the European framework, and it's in some of the global south kind of countries. So it's possible. The problem is that if you kind of slogans or narratives or motto are associated with, technocracy, expertise, government that are currently in power, then it's become very difficult to kind of dissociate from the realities and kind of re-giving hope. So you probably need to have a moment of breaking with those in power and kind of, killing the father and saying, okay, the liberals in power are the bad ones, and we will be reinventing liberals under another forms, So there is a moment where you need to kind of have something that is grassroots and not that look like a communication operation. And I think that the problem is that very often, if you look at the EU level attempt to reinvent, good narratives for promoting EU, it's so artificially EU created and so little grassroots that it doesn't work, right? So you need to find a way to have it really coming grassroots and not being created. So it's all the kind of bottom-up, top-down aspect that is probably, for the moment, difficult to reinvent. Even if there are probably a lot of grassroots initiatives that are there, right? But they are just not necessarily coordinated or not necessarily presenting themselves under the liberalism label.
Thank you. I was wondering whether your argument will ultimately going to be that we'll just need to wait until illiberals all get in power, and then liberals will suddenly find inspiration again.
Yeah,
or
that's
there
an
is a
option.
way there is a way that things can get better before they get worse, and not just after. Bennett, I would like to take you next, and since we still have 15 minutes, just encourage the audience to share some questions, comments. You have to unmute, I think. Yes.
Sorry. I'm glad that Marlene mentioned environmental protests as a universalist issue, because that's what I also wanted to bring up as an example. That I think one of the ways liberal Democrats can reposition themselves is a strategic approach of selecting issues that they can own. And I'm not saying that this would solve all the problems, because this would probably not solve the greater problem of redefining liberal democracy itself. But there are issues where I think illiberals have been silent or underrepresented, and environment is one such issue. One other issue that is somewhat more specific to certain European countries, but I was glad to hear how salient it was in the Czech Republic during a debate that was recently organized by Petra, which is the housing crisis of big European cities. It doesn't feature very high on illiberals' agenda, and it's perceived as a real problem by very wide groups of society. And a third one that I think there is a political opportunity structure there is the whole AI technological revolution and how it affects job markets. Someone needs to bring solutions to this, and illiberals haven't been very convincing in this regard, just as liberals haven't, but there's an opportunity there. But I think it's a question of political strategy, whether liberals should focus on these issues that they can own, or whether they should formulate alternative responses to the concerns that illiberals have championed, such as migration and demographic crisis. But I would opt for focusing on own issues.
Just add on that. But I think the 3 points you mentioned are great. But for liberalism to have a constructive offer for that, liberalism needs to cut links with neoliberal economics. And that's not what it's doing, right? So the whole problem of liberalism is that it got delegitimized because it's connected to neoliberalism. So if it's unable to rethink its relationship to kind of financial capitalism, it will not make it. I mean, environment, if you want to do green capitalism and greenwashing, kind of greenwashing type, okay, housing, okay, maybe housing because it's easier, but green capitalism and then AI, if you're just doing AI with some regulation EU type, it's also not solving the issue. So if liberalism cannot have a kind of very deep rethinking of its relationship with the kind of financial capitalism, then the proposal that you have that would work indeed probably will not make it. And that's the big issue, is that are they capable of doing that or not? Or who among the liberals will be able to come up with that? Not all of them. Some part of the social democracy are not ready to cut links. Right?
Yeah, and I think it's very important to highlight this linkage, and with that together, as you just said, like which liberals. So there is a variety, obviously there too, even if a lot of positions have over time in European countries in the mainstream have converged in key political issues, but there is a variety of actors at play here. Petra, I know that you want to come in, so I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you, and I will just briefly, in order not to repeat what I agree, and I think it's really important what Marlene said, and it's especially in post-communist countries. It's basically because they came hand in hand, liberalism and economic neoliberalism that in its 90s form did not really, let's say, present itself in the best way because the safeguards and the rule of law wasn't there. So that really makes it more difficult for the liberals here in this part of Europe. What I want to say is just to step back and say, just kind of summarize for the resilience. So what we need necessarily, what has to remain in place, while everything holds what Marlene and Balint said, is that we need multiple veto points, like we need institutional resilience. The constitutional order kind of should be needs to be safeguarded. And I think that it's really important to frame the conflict around shared constitutional values rather than partisan identity. I think this is really important. Institutionally, what works is you need multiple veto points, overlapping watchdogs. It's basically all about accountability, holding both the liberals and illiberals accountable, and let's see whether they deliver. And I think this is a really important point. It's no longer, it's like not going to be about whether it's liberal or illiberal, but whose policies actually deliver to the people on these issues that are there. And I think so on societal, I agree. I want to reiterate what Marlene said. The resilience is from below. It's a grassroots. It cannot be fabricated. It has to be grassroots and authentic, not fabricating. I think what we need from civil societies to repoliticize the liberalism, like just to again have like bring political conflict. I mean, the Cold War was exception because there was this big looming enemy, and the playing field was much smaller. So it was an exception, not a rule, and these times are never going back. So I think showing that freedom and fairness can be also emotionally compelling. I think it's really important, and that it's not, you can either have housing or you can have I don't know, liberal values. You have to say that you can actually have both. You can deliver on these policies without sacrificing values of liberal pluralism. And I think it's also really matters discursively. So democracy survives through contestation, and that is also to reiterate Marlene's points that what I wanted to say. I think that in this past summer, many leaders around Europe actually showed themselves that they have a very flexible relationship to liberalism, and that it's not a binary category whether you are liberal or illiberal. But I think many of them flirted a bit too hard with illiberalism on issues of like Palestine, Gaza, and other. And I don't think that's really liberal pluralism. You can, yes, the boundary is hate speech in Europe, definitely, but I think we have to provide the space for contestation, and the argument cannot be that you are like totalitarian or a terrorist when we disagree. So I think we need to end with what I wanted to end this interjection is to say we need to like have a civilized conflict, civilized disagree in a civilized way. And what Balint alluded to, we had a panel of young party members, and they were from all like liberal and illiberal, and they have really disagreed profoundly on things, but in a civilized and non-personal way. And I would much prefer to watch them on television than the professional politicians.
Thank you very much. And indeed, that was a fascinating experience also for me as a Hungarian who hasn't particularly seen much civilized political debate for the past decade and a half, at least, if not more. Okay, so we have touched on a couple of things about what democratic actors should keep in mind, should do. We mentioned the importance of grassroots mobilization, the repoliticization of civil society, putting forward emotionally compelling arguments, liberals trying to own issues which may be less dominated by the illiberal challengers, but would provide answers to people's worries and actual needs. This really brings up the question or the importance of democracy's output legitimacy. So we need democracies that do deliver and are not just technocratic constructs, yet the institutions that make them function also need to be maintained and supported. So I think we covered quite a bit of ground here with that. And as we still have a couple minutes, I would like to pick up I think two questions from the audience. One that would take us back a little bit to the culture domain that we started discussing, and is a little bit more particular, but also I would like to take another one that broadens our conversation beyond Europe, hoping that you will venture an answer to that. So the first question would be about the economic incentives toward and behind illiberalism in the cultural sphere, and whether we can also, alongside the rise of illiberal politics, observe, or is there scope for the marketability of illiberal ideas? I think we kind of touched on it, that yes, and we do see that. Is that something that is happening in the cultural sphere with new actors entering the landscape? And the other question would take us out of Europe. And the example one of our members of the audience is bringing here is that of India. And the question was like, how do we explain the rise of illiberalism in a country like India, where a lot of factors that we have listed that may have contributed to the rise of illiberalism in Europe are not present, like the lack of social progress or the waning of social progress, the end of the cultural hegemony of liberalism. These are not given. So in this context, what explains the rise? I would leave it up to you if you would like to take one or both, and who would like to jump in.
I can briefly comment on the India case. I think there is still a lot of research to be done on how we work with the concept of illiberalism in the global south, because I think a lot of the debates that have been happening so far have been noticing the kind of very Western-centric definition of illiberalism, and that it doesn't necessarily work well, or it has to be reframed when we talk about the global south, especially because in the global south, liberalism would be very much associated with colonialism. So any approach about illiberalism also immediately has something anti-colonial that we wouldn't have necessarily in the discussion, even if in Central Europe you have that aspect also. So that's one first point. Then illiberalism is now more and more used to discuss, of course, India. I saw it also to discuss Indonesia, Philippines, so it's thriving, but you can have indeed a lot of good debates, because indeed the kind of some of the social economic motivation and the political context is different, but you have some of the kind of the ideological elements that explain the rise of Modi seems to be very well kind of working with what we had in the global West, which means you may have different demographic, social economic reasons that explain the rise of illiberalism in the global south that doesn't fit with the one we have in the global north, but the ideological convergency seems to be the same, right? Rise of kind of rereading of democracy as an ethnic democracy, majoritarianism, anti-minority right, recentered on kind of values, morality, ethno-nationalism, all that works pretty well with Modi. And I think, and I'm not a specialist of Indian politics and Indian culture, but I think you could read the pre-Modi era as an era of liberalization or liberal values of the Indian scene, and Modi as a way of re-Hinduization of the national scene. So there are probably prisms, conceptual prisms that would work for the Indian case, and there have been debates about, reading Xi Jinping in China as an illiberal case, version again on the Chinese communist kind of version. So I think it's an interesting debate that is still kind of going on among scholars from the global south, and they bring really a super interesting and kind of refreshing perspective on the concept.
Thank you very much, Marlon. Anybody interested in taking the culture question?
Yeah, I'm glad to try to answer. So my understanding of illiberal cultural products marketability comes from a context where an illiberal government is in power, and that's my case knowledge. And in such cases, what I see is that such cultural products and artists are heavily subsidized by the state, actually against low market demand. And even with these often very disproportionate subsidies, they do not do very well in the market. So, for instance, if you take a look at last year's movie screening statistics in Hungary, there was a noticeable trend that independent productions that did not receive public funding from the Hungarian state did better in terms of audience numbers. And some of the flagship cultural products, including the most expensive historical movie produced in Hungary of all times, did quite poorly. So I don't see a genuine market demand for illiberal culture in such a context. Yet I could imagine that where illiberal niche subcultures are in opposition, or they have some underground revolutionary elements to them, there could be a genuine market interest, but not where illiberals are in power.
Yeah, and if I can just pick up on what Balint has said, and I think this is a perfect lakmus test, because illiberals love to say that they speak in the name of the silent majority. So probably they're making these historical movies, which are like terribly boring, and they spend so much money that they want you to sit in the cinema for 4 hours. But what I'm trying to say is there is no silent majority. This is a radicalized minority, that takes over because liberals have failed, for either because they are not so liberal anymore themselves, or that they couldn't face the contemporary challenges. But I think that what really remains, and what I think will be challenging, is, like, to go beyond these labels and still stay within the realm of the truth. That, like, I think truthfulness in the public discourse, it's really it's going to be really a challenge. So we have tried to dispel some of these labels and say where it's more muddy. I understand it cannot be very often black and white, but still you cannot, like, green is not going to be blue, and so on. So I think this is like the silver lining also on what Balint has said for Hungary and beyond, is that that this is not an appealing project, that it works on repression. It's maybe initially kind of appealing, but then it turns out that it doesn't deliver on the promise either, that it has been a lot of lies well packaged, or that it actually has to employ more and more repression and coercion. And I think in a medium and long term, that just doesn't work, because we don't want to live in that way. It's just depends on how long that medium term takes, and how destroyed or damaged the institutions are going to be when it ends.
Thank you very much, Petra. And these were also excellent concluding words that I do not think I can really top. And as we are also out of time, I do not have to. So I would just like to thank you all on the panel, and also in the audience, for spending the past hour and a half with us. It has been really wide-ranging and and thought-provoking discussion. So for that, Balint, Petra, Marlene, thank you very much for your contributions, and to the audience, thank you for your questions. To close, I will put our website's link to the chat. Please follow us. We have a newsletter with which we keep you up to date. You can also find us on Facebook, X, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn, where we regularly post updates and the outputs of the AUTHLIB project. We are concluding our research at the end of January, so you will definitely see a big wave of papers coming out from us in the next months. So it is the time to start following. Once again, thank you for being here, and I hope to see you at our future events and discussions. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Merci, au revoir.
Bye.